Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to offend anybody by calling it children's literature, because I know we're not children. We are very grown-up fifth graders. So just for name's sake, today we're going to call children's literature anything that is for reading for people that are under the age of 21. And to begin with fantasy, fantasy is a subcategory of children's literature. It is a type of literature. Can anyone tell me what they think fantasy might be? Tiffany?
Something that involves the imagination.
Close. It's something. It's any type of story. Can you read that? Can you see it? I don't know how to read this. Okay. Well, anyways, it is any story of the impossible. In other words, it is a story that is not real, it is made up, and it cannot happen in real life. And you might want to write that down for future knowledge. Now, can anyone give me an example of maybe a story that they read or a book that they would consider to be a fantasy book, something that's made up?
Charlotte's Web?
You're correct. That is a very good example. The example that I brought today was Pinocchio. Now, Pinocchio is a fantasy book because it involves a man who creates a child out of wood, and this wooden child becomes a real person. Now, that cannot possibly happen in real life. So that would be considered a fantasy book. Next, I have a story called Sarah Plain and Tall. Is anyone familiar with this book? Okay, good. Sarah Plain and Tall is not a fantasy book. It is a story about a father and his two daughters whose mother and his wife have died, and they get a stepmother. And that is very possible. That does happen, and that could be real. So that is not a fantasy story. Another example that I brought in was the true story of the Three Little Pigs. Now, can anyone tell me if this is fantasy or non-fantasy?
Fantasy.
Correct. It is a fantasy book because it depicts animals with human characteristics. Now, animals do not typically build houses of bricks, and big bad wolves do not come around and try and blow them down. So this is not a real story. It is a fantasy. And lastly, I have Bridge to Terabithia. Has anyone read this? Bridge to Terabithia is about a boy and a girl who become best friends, and they build a secret castle in the woods that they live near. And that is a non-fantasy book also, because it's a story that could actually happen. Now, just to review a little bit of what fantasy books might be, here are a list of a couple of books. There's Mary Poppins, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, The Rescuers, and The Outsiders. Now, who could tell me what Mary Poppins would be? Do you think that's something that could really happen?
It's a fantasy.
Correct, it's a fantasy. And Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim and The Rescuers, those are both fantasy also because they have animals that have human characteristics. Now, how about The Outsiders? Does anyone know?
It's not.
Right, it is a non-fantasy story because it could very well really happen. Now, for a few minutes, I want everybody to get together in groups of two, so two and so forth around the table. And I need everybody to take out just one piece of paper for the two groups. You only need one piece for every two. And I want you to be able to write down 3 books or stories that you would consider to be a fantasy story, something that is made up, something that is not real and couldn't happen in real life. And in case you're not really familiar with a couple of stories that might be a fantasy story, I've written some books up on the board, and you could use that as a guide, but I want you to be very careful because not all of the books that are on the board are fantasy. Some are non-fantasy books, so you really need to ask yourself, could this really happen? Or is this something that's just made up? And I'm going to come around and I'm going to look and see what everybody's doing, and then I'm going to call on a couple of you to tell me whether or not a book that you chose was a fantasy book, and I want you to tell me why. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that.
So we should choose one of those up there?
Well, you can. If you can think of 3 that aren't up there, that's fine too. But just in case you're not real sure of 3 that would be fantasy, you can use that as a guide. Okay, now coming back, because we only have a limited amount of time for this today, how about Peggy, what did you come up with? Name one of the stories you chose.
Peter Pan.
Okay, Peter Pan, and you think that's a fantasy, tell me why.
Because I'm always going to fly.
Good, good, very good, that's a good example. Paula?
How about the Snow White story? Story Snow White.
Good, that's another good example, and that is a fantasy. Typically speaking, you're not going to have a girl who has a bunch of little dwarfs with little different characteristics following her around. So that's a very good example also. Now I want everybody to tell me if they can, what is a fantasy story? It is what? Something that
It's not real.
that is not real. Very good. Okay, and after you think about a fantasy story, something that isn't real, and you had to categorize it into some kind of literature, what would that literature be? Now think carefully because I mentioned it at the very beginning. Tiffany.
Children's literature?
Thank you. Very good. Children's literature. Now I want everyone to take this handout tonight, and it's going to be your homework assignment. And what you're going to need to do is be very careful and think closely whether or not the stories that are listed are something that are real or something that is not real and that could not happen, which is fantasy. And in the spaces indicated next to the story, I want you to place an F if it's a fantasy story, and if it is a non-fantasy story, I want you to leave it empty, the space empty. So I'm going to pass these out, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to have you get your spelling books out, and then we'll get ready to move on to the next lesson today.
Very good. Nice start to the day.
Oh, thank you. And you'll have to share.
Let's give Amy some positive feedback. Her knees are shaking, let her know she did a good job.
Yeah, it's real.
Thank you.
Peggy?
I think the taste was very nice, her voice was good, she was positive.
Right.
I could specifically tell where she followed the format of the deductive lesson.
Right. I like that she has the actual book sitting there. And
Fantasy stories, and one in particular was called The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. Do you remember me mentioning that? Okay, good. Well, not only is this story a fantasy story, but it can also be classified as something else that goes a little bit further than that. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. You're going to have to pay very close attention to the examples and the non-examples that I give you, because you're going to have to figure out what this concept is on your own. Now, like I said, this would be an example, another example of the concept to be learned today. Now, could anybody tell me a characteristic of this story?
It's a children's book.
Okay. And I'll go ahead and write examples. And another one's over there. Okay.
It has animals that have human traits.
Okay. Anything else?
fantasy book.
Yes, it is a fantasy book. I'll put that up here, but it doesn't really matter that it is a fantasy story, but that's good. It is one. Anyone else? Okay. Now this would be a non-example. It's Downy the Duckling, and it's just a little boy who talks about his pet duck and the kind of things that this duck does. Now, can anyone give me a characteristic of this book? Something that would be different from the examples that are listed.
The animal is portrayed as itself.
Okay. Animal as self. Anyone else?
Is there a person in it?
Okay, yes, it does have a person in it. But I'll put a little star by that because it's not a major point of this concept. Anyone else? Okay. Here are a few more examples. Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, Curious George, Peter Rabbit. Those are all examples of this concept. Some non-examples are Benji, Old Yeller, and Lassie. Now, can anyone tell me a couple more characteristics under the example side?
The examples are, they're all cartoon and all animated.
Okay, they're all cartoons. And what about the non-examples? The real animals. Good, that's a good point.
They're all heroes.
Okay, they're all heroes.
They're pets.
They're pets. Okay, I'm going to give you one more example, and that would be Babar. Now, is there anything about this story that is not listed under the example side, but would be an example of this story?
It's about a circus.
Okay. It's about a circus.
Animals are the main character.
Okay.
Animals are the main characters.
And for my last non-example would be Bath Time. And this is a story about how animals clean themselves. And what are some characteristics of this? It's not animated, and it shows how the animals do their daily activities in their real environment.
More of a factual book.
Okay, it's more factual. Actually, someone hit it right on the nose. And what we've been talking about is anthropomorphic stories. And I just messed up. Anthropomorphic stories are animals with human traits. And they differentiate from the non-examples. Although there are some patterns in these examples and non-examples. For instance, they're both about animals, and most of them have a person in them. What is different is that in the non-examples, they do act as they are as real animals. And in the examples, under anthropomorphic, they are cartoons, they have personal characteristics, they would go grocery shopping and do the things that humans do. Okay, now that we understand what anthropomorphic is, I'm going to show you a real definition. It's stories where the main characters are not humans, but they do depict human characteristics. And now that we understand that concept, I want to ask you a couple questions. Can anyone define what anthropomorphic is? I just did it, so you should be able to do it.
It's a story where the characters aren't human, but they act like
Very good, you're correct. And can anyone tell me why The Wizard of Oz might be considered an anthropomorphic story?
because the lion had human traits.
Excellent, yes. The lion acted like a human. And could anyone else give me an example of what an anthropomorphic story or a character, an example of one?
Dr. Seuss.
But more specifically, he's the author, but
The Cat in the Hat.
yes, the cat in the hat. Now, before I pass out a little take-home quiz that I've prepared for everyone, I want everyone, if they think this is the correct answer, to raise their hand. If you think that it would be an anthropomorphic story, I want you to raise your hand. It's called Sylvester and the Magic Pebble. Do you think that would be an anthropomorphic? Okay, very good, it is. And how about all kinds of dogs? Let me show you a couple of the illustrations. Now raise your hand if you think this is an anthropomorphic story. Nobody? Okay. My last example is an anteater named Arthur. Now, I want you to raise your hand if this is a non-example. Okay, what if I say it's an anthropomorphic story? Great. Okay, it seems like you understand the concept very well, and I'm going to pass out your take-home quiz. A couple of the questions on here are ones that I have discussed already, so I expect that you'll be able to get those answers correct. And I'll be on my way so that our next teacher can begin your next lesson. Also a type of children's literature. You might want to remember that, but it is different from a fantasy story. Yesterday we also looked at the true story of the 3 little pigs, and although this is a fantasy story, it can be taken a little bit further and it will become something else. Now when you look at this book, what are some characteristics that you think of?
Fiction.
Okay. Okay, anything else? What kind of characters do you see in this? Okay, I need one more.
I guess the animals are that
Okay. Sort of and like people. This is another example of the concept that we're talking about. It's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in school days. Now, everybody knows who the turtles are. And what do you think that turtles do in this book? And they go to school. Now, does that seem normal to you that turtles would be going to school? I didn't think so. And how about Mickey Mouse and the Lucky Goose Chase? This is another example of our concept. Can anyone tell me something about this book? What kind of animals they are inside of it? Maybe what they do? Okay. So that would be kind of like this. Mickey's acting like a person. He's acting like a farmer. Okay, I have a couple more examples up on the overhead, and they would be Winnie the Pooh, the Rescuers, Curious George, and Peter Rabbit. Now, can anyone tell me what those examples might have in common? Besides the fact that they're all animals. Okay, they're not real. Okay, now I have some non-examples up here, and those are Benji, Old Yeller, and Lassie. Now, can anyone tell me what they think of when they think of those animals? Pardon me? Okay, they're all dogs. And what kind of things do they do? Everybody's familiar with these animals.
They do things a dog do.
Okay, that's very important. They do things dogs do. Okay, I'm going to show you one more example of another book that is a non-example, and that is Downy the Duckling. And this is the story of a little boy, and he has a couple of duck eggs, and they hatch, and they're real live little chicks, and then it just talks about the kinds of things that his little ducklings do. Now, what would be some characteristics of maybe what a little duck does? Quack? Okay. Okay, now does anybody see any patterns or any sort of relationship between the examples and the non-examples?
This is nonfiction.
Okay, this is nonfiction. Okay. But to be a little more specific, okay, if these are all non-examples, we can kind of cross those out because those aren't characteristics of the concept that we're talking about. Now, okay, they're all animals, but they're also not real. So we can cross off animals. What's important to know is that they're not real. And another thing that isn't really important to this concept is that they go to school. So leaving the examples that are left up here, can anyone tell me approximately what they think this concept is that we're talking about? Talks about animals, and they're fictitious, which also means that they're not real, and they act like people. Close. What we're talking about is anthropomorphic. And actually, I think it was Rick that gave me the example that they act like people. What an anthropomorphic story is where the main characters are not human, but they depict human characteristics. And that would be an example, like I said, the true story with the little pigs. The pigs built houses of their own with sticks and stones and bricks, and there was a protagonist, an antagonist, and the wolf was trying to get at the pigs, and they spoke like regular people, and that doesn't really happen. And that's why they're called anthropomorphic stories. Okay, Rick, could you give me an example of a story or a character that would be an anthropomorphic character or story?
Cat in the Hat,
Okay, why?
because the cat takes on human characteristics.
Good job. Okay, Denise, how about you? What would be an example of a non-anthropomorphic character or story? Okay, Alyssa, tell me why.
Because it's real and it acts like literally.
Acts like a real dog. Good. Okay. Now, when I hand up this book, I want you to tell me if it is a non-example or an example. This is a story about a chipmunk and things that the chipmunk does in the forest. Would this be an example of an anthropomorphic story?
No.
No, because it depicts how the animal really lives. Now, this is a little bit tricky. Be careful. This is called Jump, Frog, Jump. Do you think this would be an anthropomorphic story or not? It is a cartoon, but it just shows the kinds of things that frogs do.
It's a non-example.
Yes, it's a non-example because the frog doesn't talk and he doesn't act like a person. He acts like a regular frog would. Okay, now can anyone tell me what an anthropomorphic story or a character would be?
An animal who acts like a person.
Very good, you're right. An animal that would act like a person. Now, at the very beginning of the lesson, I specifically said that an anthropomorphic story is a specific kind of literature. Can anybody tell me what that is? Very good, you're right, children's literature. Now, I have a homework assignment for you. It's an anthropomorphic quiz, but don't panic because it's a take-home quiz and you can do this after you get home this evening. And basically, it's all about the things that we talked about today. For example, I'll give you one of the questions to talk about. The Wizard of Oz. Now, that would be an anthropomorphic story, and can anyone tell me why? Correct.
Does the lion talk in the story?
Good, very good. He talked and he acted just like a human, even though he was a lion. Okay, well, I'm passing out this take-home quiz. Once I hand it to you, you can go ahead and get your coat and line up, and it'll be time to go home. Thanks.
Sitting on your only